I have no plans here except to answer questions. More efficient way to do it is if you've got questions, post them to B courses. You'll get a written response from me. But we're going to do this now. And just to kind of go through things, next Thursday, 7 p.m. in 245 Li Ka-shing, brand new building, brand new lecture hall, very big, very comfortable, very close to Oxford Street. For DSP students, I don't know what the story is yet. I do know that DSP is going to take care of your accommodations. They're committed to that. Probably be Thursday afternoon, but the actual details about precise time and place, they just haven't gotten to me yet. They're very busy. They're understaffed and overworked, and they'll get to me. And as soon as they get to me, I'll get to you. This exam is construed as a 2-hour exam, 1 hour essentially a second midterm, 1 hour cumulative final, but you've got the full 3 hours for it. I hope you won't need it, but it's there if you want it. We've got this review session. There's the scope of the exam, the cumulative and non-cumulative parts of the exam. And just to remind you of all the resources that are available for review. So just to kind of take us through this, let's go in order through the materials since the first exam and see if you have any questions. And if we get through it all before the 50 minutes is done, we'll go back and cycle through the beginning. Okay, so first we talked about coma and anesthesia, distinctions between coma and vegetative state, minimally conscious state, how you'd know, what some of the neural problems are in these syndromes, and some of the issues related to the diagnosis of the minimally conscious state. Any questions there? Yes?
Can you explain a study where the ERP response to their name?
Yeah, there was a study in which scalp electrodes were placed on these. They were essentially vegetative patients at this point. And then they were, the patients were presented with meaningful material, like their own name, and meaningless material. And the idea there is that meaningful verbal linguistic material ought to activate the language processing centers in the brain. And it did. When these patients were presented with their own name and other meaningful verbal material, left hemisphere language centers like Wernicke's area and Broca's area were activated, but not to non-meaningful material. So what you've got there is differential response. It's one thing for you to play a noise for a comatose patient and for the brain of the comatose patient to change in some ways. That could just be some kind of automatic startle reflex or something like that. Here you were getting a more differential the response, which suggested that for the patients who did show this response, that at least there was some kind of complex cognitive processing going on. Okay? All right. Just as a cautionary note, remember, these signals were only recorded in a minority of these patients, okay? So it's not the case that every comatose patient or every vegetative patient is actually at least minimally conscious. That's just not the case. But it does happen from time to time. Anything else about coma? All right. And then we did some comparable things about anesthesia. We talked about how anesthesia is induced and how anesthesia is measured in the clinic, both behaviorally and physiologically, some of the cognitive psychology of anesthesia in terms of its effects on memory. Yes? Uh-huh. Well, the general idea is that first behind converging operations is that you've got these kind of 4 qualities that an altered state of consciousness ought to have. first and foremost, there ought to be a change in subjective experience. If there's no change in subjective experience, there's no point in talking about an altered state of consciousness. Then you'd like to see other kinds of features associated with that, like an induction procedure or behavioral changes associated with the changes in subjective experience, or physiological changes associated with the changes in subjective experience. But the general idea behind the induction procedure is that usually some altered state of consciousness is induced by some procedure. Take a simple, almost stupidly simple example, psychedelic drug states. Well, they're induced by taking a psychedelic drug. You got to ingest LSD. That's the induction procedure. In hypnosis, the induction procedure is more drawn out. There are these suggestions for relaxation and focused attention and eye closure that precede the rest of the hypnotic encounter. In meditation, you've got to assume a posture and focus on your mantra and all of that kind of stuff. In sleep, you got to crawl into bed and turn out the lights. There usually is some kind of induction procedure that's associated with this, but there doesn't have to be. It's just, again, these are not defining features that are singly necessary and jointly sufficient for there to be an altered state of consciousness. It's just that the prototypical altered state of consciousness has an induction procedure, changes in subjective experience, behavioral changes, and physiological changes. Is that okay? Anything else on anesthesia? All right, we can always come back to this. Then sleep and dreams. We talked about the physiology of sleep. Behaviorally, we think of sleep as just something you go into and then you wake up out of. But it turns out that when you actually do actual physiological recording of brain activity and other parameters, we can discern at least 4 or 5 different kinds of sleep that people go through in a cyclical fashion throughout the night, beginning with descending stage 1, going into stage 2, disappearance of alpha activity and all of that. Then 3 and 4 as the EEG slows. Then up into what looks like stage 1, but is really a different stage of sleep entirely because it's marked by rapid eye movements. That's stage REM, where a lot of dreaming tends to occur. We talked about some of the various behavioral phenomena that are associated with different stages of sleep. And we talked about various aspects of sleep and learning and memory. Yeah. 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 Well, there's a controversy about this, and so the most important thing is to know that there is a controversy about it. Some authors think there isn't a controversy about it. For example, Alan Hobson predicates his entire AIM theory on the idea that there is a more or less one-to-one correspondence between stage REM and dreaming. But it turns out that you can get evidence of dreaming in stage N REM as well, depending a lot on how you define a dream. But even if you use very strict criteria, you can get dream reports about 20-25% of the time when you awaken somebody out of stage N REM. In stage N REM, the dreams seem to be more realistic, perhaps. The dream reports are shorter. There might be less emotion, but still about 20-25% of the time you get dreamy dreams out of stage N REM. Now, again, this is ambiguous evidence because what you might be getting when you awaken somebody out of N REM is a memory of a dream that occurred in REM. You don't know. You have no way of knowing, right? That's one of the things that makes dream research so difficult, is that you really have no independent corroboration of the dream report. I mean, you don't even know whether the dream actually occurred or whether the subject is just telling you something to make you feel better. But that's the general idea here. And again, a lot a lot depends on this. If you're Alan Hobson, a lot depends on the fact that dreams are confined to stage REM. Other theorists like Mark Solms or Bill Domhoff, they're not so confined. They're not so interested in that because they argue that. Whereas Hobson argues that the same process that triggers REM also triggers the dreams. People like Solms and Domhoff argue that there's a process that triggers REM. It's a pontine process, waves arising from the pons. But there's a separate mechanism entirely, more cortical, maybe more frontal, that is responsible for the dreaming. So again, this is all a matter of grist for the theoretical mill. Yeah. They're pretty much the same except for where they occur. Hypnagogic states occur as you're falling asleep. Hypnopompic states occur when you're waking up. Hypnagogic states have been studied more frequently, though they're not been studied frequently at all. And the reason for that basically is convenience. We know when somebody's falling asleep. We can bring him in the sleep lab and put him to bed and talk to him as he's falling asleep. But you never really know when somebody's going to wake up. So it's hard. The hypnopompic states are hard to catch. But that's basically the difference. Yes. Yeah. We have known since the 1950s and the work of Simon and Emmons that sleep learning is possible to the extent that the subject stays awake, okay? Which is to say that sleep learning doesn't occur at all. One problem with that early literature is that it was all based on what we would now recognize as explicit memory for the material presented during sleep. Can the person, after a night of sleep learning, recall or recognize new material that was presented during sleep? And the answer is no, okay? If you take care to present the material during alpha-free sleep, sleep learning simply doesn't appear to occur. However, after 1987, when people began to accept this distinction between explicit and implicit memory, the question about sleep learning got raised one more time, and it was a simple question. Well, okay, sleep learning doesn't occur as far as explicit memory is concerned, but maybe sleep learning can occur as far as implicit memory is concerned. And there were some early hints in the literature that this might be the case. But there had never been a formal study of it until James Wood came along. This was his doctoral dissertation, in which he actually did a formal comparison of explicit and implicit memory for material presented during sleep, taking care to present the material during alpha-free periods of sleep, and doing all the things you're supposed to do. It's a perfect sleep study. And he found nothing. He found no evidence of priming at all.